okay, these private corporations will drill more. There's no guarantee that they're going to ensure that supply is that Americans will be prioritized with that supply. Yeah. There's no guarantee. In fact, I will guarantee you that they will sell those fossil fuels to the highest bidder.
Well, everyone, I have some very good news for a change. Oil futures have dropped below $100 a barrel. This will almost certainly lead to lower gas prices in the future. This either means that corporate greed has gone down in this particular sector of the economy, or President Biden, who of course controls gas prices with a joystick from the Oval Office, has finally decided to make them go lower. I'm just kidding, of course. It's good that oil prices are going down, but the likely reason why they are is not the greatest. Here's what Bloomberg News wrote on the topic. West Texas Intermediate crude futures dropped below $100 a barrel for the first time since May 11th, as concerns grow that a global economic slowdown will ultimately hobble demand. Traders are worried about the impact of sharply higher U.S. borrowing costs, as the Federal Reserve embarks on a series of interest rate hikes intended to cool inflation. Adding to the bearish sentiment, Citigroup Incorporated said that oil prices could collapse to $65 a barrel by the end of this year and slump to $45 a barrel by the end of 2023 if a demand-crippling recession hits. So yeah, this is mixed news at best. Gas prices may well fall, but that will likely happen due to declining demand from a global recession. An awful lot of people struggle through recessions, which is why you like to avoid those sorts of things, but they are sometimes necessary. Lower gas prices will be a silver lining though, at least in my opinion. There are some environmentalists who want gas prices to go to the moon so that we start to use different kinds of energy. But I think most of their assumptions are flawed, to say the least. One of the upsides of lower gas prices is that we'll likely be disabused of some of the dumbest economic ideas I've heard in quite some time. During this period of high gas prices, I've heard both Crystal Ball of Breaking Points and Anna Kasparian of the Young Turks suggest that the United States should not only nationalize oil companies,
rather than tweak and incentivize and hope to drive the result we want, we should nationalize the oil companies and directly achieve the outcome that we want. The outcome which is in the best interest of the American people for today and for tomorrow.
We haven't nationalized these natural resources, right? We haven't nationalized oil or natural gas.
But that these companies should stop selling outside of the borders of the United States.
And so what will happen? Okay, these private corporations will drill more. There's no guarantee that they're going to ensure that supply is that Americans will be prioritized with that supply. Yes. There's no guarantee. In fact, I will guarantee you that they will sell those fossil fuels to the highest bidder.
We just don't keep that oil. It's nothing but a lie. They could sell it to anyone they want.
Exactly.
It doesn't stay in the country. So the entire narrative of drill so we'll have more oil is 100% lie.
Whenever we're looking at exports, why are we exporting all this gas? And the more people I spoke to, the same answer. We live in a capitalist country. Because they can. And I'm like, yeah, okay, but they also get a lot of subsidies. And under the 1975 law, we declare oil a strategic asset, and we basically can control the entire price of oil by the president.
To their credit, both of them acknowledge that the first one is an absolute non-starter.
I mean, yeah, okay, it's true. Nationalization is not gonna happen, but it is the most elegant solution because you can ramp up the refinery capacity. You can end the exporting of oil for the temporary. You can increase the amount of gas flow right now and prepare to wind it down over the long term.
And they're right. It's a political non-starter, and for good reason. Nationalizing our oil companies would be a terrible strategy for a number of reasons. This is what Venezuela did after all. But please, tell me more about how bringing up that country is just a straw man. That's a topic that I'll definitely be revisiting sometime, but not today. Today we're going to talk about the latter proposal. No longer exporting American oil. What would happen if we did this? Well, we don't know for sure, but we aren't totally without precedent for this sort of thing. About 15 years ago, a number of countries did exactly this, just with another commodity, crops. It had exactly the opposite effect that was intended. While gas prices are high now, they're not the highest they've been even in recent memory. When adjusted for inflation, oil prices peaked at $147 a barrel in July of 2008. I remember this time, people were very concerned about so-called peak oil and concerned about the strength of the dollar. Meanwhile, demand was higher due to economic growth in developing nations, most notably India and China. Furthermore, political turmoil was more pronounced in the Middle East than it is even now. The Middle East is, of course, a major oil-producing region. Eventually, the price of crude oil fell fell precipitously. As was true with the rise, the drop was multifaceted, though the primary driving force were the effects of the Great Recession. Demand went down dramatically around the globe, and the price of oil fell off a cliff. During this period of high prices, people understandably took action to cope. In the United States, Congress passed the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007, wherein the government mandated that ethanol use from products like corn reach at least 15 billion gallons by 2015. This government action accelerated an already existing trend. As Robert Paulberg wrote in Food Politics, between 1983 and 2010, ethanol production jumped from 2.8 billion gallons to 13 billion gallons, and by 2012, the percentage of America's corn harvest processed in ethanol distilleries had reached an astonishing 40%. Some of this would have happened even without government mandates. When fossil fuel prices are high and corn prices are low, people will naturally seek to substitute one with the other. Furthermore, the United States wasn't the only government to pursue this sort of replacement policy. There are a number of issues with biofuels of this sort, more issues than I could possibly talk about in one video. But what's relevant here is that when you decide you're going to use crops as fuel, you're necessarily going to make food more expensive, which is exactly what happened. According to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, in 2008, the cereal price index reached a peak 2.8 times higher than in 2000. As of July 2010, it remained 1.9 times higher than in 2000. There wasn't one factor that led to this increase in global food prices. There almost never is just one factor that leads to increased prices in any good or service, but the shift towards biofuels definitely contributed in a significant way. Ironically, the nations that led the way in this shift tended to be developed nations, whereas the nations hit hardest by the increases in food prices were developing or poor nations. In fact, a lot of countries experienced political unrest due to these high food prices. In response to this, various governments cracked down on food exports in an attempt to stabilize prices at home. As Robert Paulberg wrote in Food Politics, China imposed export taxes on grains and grain products. Argentina raised export taxes on wheat, corn, and soybeans. Russia raised export taxes on wheat. Malaysia and Indonesia imposed export taxes on palm oil. Egypt, Cambodia, Vietnam, and Indonesia eventually banned exports of rice. India, the world's third largest rice exporter, banned exports of rice other than basmati. This only led to further increases in food prices, as importers began panic buying in anticipation of further export restrictions. This even hit the United States, when in April of 2008, Costco and Sam's Club had to limit sales of rice to 4 bags per customer per visit. The most hurt, though, were urban dwellers in poor and developing nations, including in nations that implemented the export bans themselves. Something similar happened when food prices spiked in 2010 and 2011. The spike was, once again, in part due to increased demand for biofuels in response to rising gas prices. According to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, the food price index rose 6.5% from December of 2010 to February of 2011. As was the case just a few years prior, this inspired a number of export bans, most notably a wheat export ban from Russia. Export bans only compound the problem of increased food prices, as they inspired panic buying and further export bans, which further distorted prices. Once again, it was the poor nations of the world that were most adversely affected. As the World Bank reported, a country that has a high share of agriculture and food in total output consumption, employment, trade, and government revenues is particularly vulnerable to volatility in international food prices. Low-income countries are particularly susceptible, as agriculture in these countries accounts for close to 1/3 of the value added and 2/3 of total employment, nearly 3 times as much in low-income countries, emerging market, and developing economies. A high share of net food buyers among the poorest segments of society heightens the adverse effects of food price spikes on poverty and income distribution. In low-income economies, most households are net buyers of food, which spend on average close to 60% of their income on food, more than 1/3 more than in low-income emerging market and developing economies. So what would happen if we took this approach with oil? No more exporting oil that oil companies drill out of our ground. We get to keep that all within our borders. First off, I just have to say that it's ridiculous that these people expect that these companies should go through all the trouble of maintaining oil rigs, transporting the oil to refineries, then transporting the refined gas to customers, only to be able to sell it exclusively to customers that the government approves of. Then again, these people think that we should be nationalizing these companies, so it's not like naked power grabs are something they're ashamed of. But I'm not here to moralize. I'm here to look at things from a purely economic perspective. While we cannot say for sure what would happen, there are good reasons to believe that it would probably play out in a similar way that the food export restrictions did. Other nations would probably reciprocate, either out of retaliation or out of an attempt to stabilize prices in their own country, and panic buying would ensue. This would likely encourage more rationing via government policy. We've already got inflation going. I suppose we may as well get gas lines as well, so we can feel like we're really in the 1970s, if that's what we're really trying to do here. I'm going to close with this. It's a paragraph from the book Open by Johan Norberg. I highly recommend the book. Norberg argues that open societies are the most prosperous, ethical, and safe. During tough times, the temptation to bunker down really kicks in, but that will only make things worse. As Norberg writes, even though the world often moves in a nationalist direction during crises, these are the times when we most urgently need international agreements to forgo beggar-thy-neighbor policies. We rarely think of it this way, but globalization is actually our best chance to fight pandemics. And I would add to that, combat high fuel prices. In the first place, since wealth, communication, technology, and open science have made our response to new diseases faster than ever. Harnessing the resources and the minds of the entire Earth is our best way to get through this. Closing the world off would just make things worse, possibly more than we can anticipate.